You believe your dollars have value because the government says they do, because banks accept them, because you can exchange them for goods and services. But there was a specific moment when that value became purely based on confidence rather than anything tangible, and that moment was August 15th, 1971, when President Nixon announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. And what most people don't understand is that this wasn't just a technical adjustment to international monetary policy. It was the removal of the last restraint preventing unlimited currency creation. And from that moment forward, every dollar you saved became subject to devaluation that couldn't be stopped by any physical limit, only by the discipline of institutions that had every incentive to print rather than restrain. Before 1971, the dollar was backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce, which meant that in theory, any dollar could be exchanged for a specific amount of gold. And while this convertibility was limited to foreign governments rather than individual citizens, it still created a constraint on how many dollars could exist, because if you printed too many dollars relative to your gold reserves, other countries would demand conversion and your gold would flow out. And this threat of gold outflow created discipline. It forced some relationship between the money supply and physical reality. It meant that dollars represented claims on something scarce, rather than just pieces of paper or electronic entries that could be multiplied without limit. But that constraint frustrated certain interests, particularly the United States government, which wanted to finance both domestic programs and the Vietnam War without raising taxes or cutting spending. And throughout the 1960s, the government printed dollars beyond what the gold reserve could support, and foreign governments, particularly France, began demanding gold in exchange for the dollars they held, and the gold started flowing out of Fort Knox. And by 1971, it became clear that if this continued, the United States would run out of gold entirely, would be forced to either stop printing money or admit that the dollar wasn't actually backed by gold anymore. And faced with this choice, Nixon chose to cut the connection entirely, to remove the constraint, to transform the dollar from a claim on gold into pure fiat currency backed by nothing except the government's promise and the public's continued willingness to accept it. And here's what almost nobody understood at the time, what still isn't widely understood today, because when Nixon made that announcement, when he closed the gold window, he didn't frame it as removing backing from the dollar. He framed it as a temporary measure to protect against speculators, as a necessary step to preserve American economic independence, and he promised it would be temporary, that new international monetary arrangements would be negotiated, but those negotiations never produced any new backing, never restored any physical constraint. Instead, they formalized a system of floating exchange rates where currencies had value only relative to each other, where no currency was anchored to anything tangible, where every major government could print as much money as they wanted, limited only by the fear of losing confidence. And this created the exact incentive structure that led predictably to what came next. What came next was inflation, unlike anything Americans had experienced in peacetime, because once the gold constraint was removed, once there was no physical limit on money creation, the temptation to print became irresistible, and throughout the 1970s, the money supply expanded dramatically. The government continued financing deficits through monetary creation, and prices rose accordingly. And if you were a saver during this period, if you had accumulated dollars in bank accounts or bonds, you watched those dollars lose over 60% of their purchasing power between 1971 and 1980. And this wasn't gradual or gentle. This was your savings being systematically destroyed, while the government and Federal Reserve told you that inflation was caused by oil shocks or corporate greed or anything except the obvious truth that they had removed the restraint on money printing and then printed excessively. Now I need you to understand the mechanism here, because it's critical to seeing how this connects to your current situation, to your retirement savings, to every dollar you've worked to accumulate. And the mechanism is this: when the government spends more than it collects in taxes, it needs to borrow the difference, and it borrows by issuing bonds. And those bonds promise to pay back dollars plus interest. But where do those repayment dollars come from if the government is already spending more than it takes in? And the answer is that they come from printing, from the Federal Reserve creating new money to buy government bonds. And this money creation increases the money supply. And when the money supply grows faster than the production of real goods and services, each dollar becomes worth less, which means that while the government pays back the nominal amount it borrowed, the real value of that repayment is reduced by inflation. And this is how governments default on debt without explicitly refusing to pay. They default by devaluing the currency in which the debt is denominated, and the people who suffer from this implicit default are always the savers, the people holding currency or bonds denominated in that currency. And here's why 1971 matters specifically, why removing gold backing changed everything for savers. Because as long as there was some connection to gold, even a tenuous one, there was a limit to how much debasement could occur before the system faced a reckoning, before the contradiction between the printed dollars and the gold reserve became impossible to hide. But once that connection was severed, once money became pure fiat with no physical anchor, the limits became psychological rather than physical. They became about confidence rather than conversion, and confidence can be managed, shaped, manipulated through communication and policy in ways that physical gold reserves cannot. And this shift from physical constraint to confidence management fundamentally changed the risks facing savers. Let me show you what this looks like in practical terms, because the numbers are stark and revealing. And in 1971, you could buy a gallon of gasoline for 36 cents, a postage stamp for 8 cents, a new car for roughly $3,000, a median home for roughly $25,000, and if you had saved $10,000 in 1971, that was meaningful wealth, enough for a down payment on a house, enough to support a family for a year, if needed, enough to feel financially secure. But if you held that $10,000 in a savings account, earning typical interest rates through the 1970s, by 1980, that same $10,000 could buy maybe 40% of what it could buy in 71. Because while you earned maybe 5 or 6% interest annually, inflation was running at 8 or 10 or 12%, which means you lost 3 to 6% annually in real terms, and over a decade, that compounds to a massive loss of purchasing power. And this happened not because you made bad decisions, not because you were careless or unlucky, but because the system was restructured in 1971 in a way that made this outcome inevitable. If you're following this series, if you're watching these episodes as they release and building understanding sequentially, rather than seeing isolated videos, you're starting to recognize something important, which is that these historical crimes against savings aren't random events. They're deliberate policy choices made by institutions that benefit from devaluing currency. And the people who follow this series episode by episode, who subscribe and turn on notifications, they're building a framework that lets them see current policy decisions in the context of historical patterns. And that context changes everything, because it transforms confusing economic jargon into clear mechanisms of transfer. It shows you who benefits and who loses. It reveals that what looks like technical monetary policy is actually systematic wealth redistribution from savers to debtors and institutions. Now let me connect this to the present moment, because the mechanisms created or accelerated by the crime of 1971 are operating right now at scales that would have seemed impossible in the 70s. And since 1971, the United States has operated under pure fiat currency, with no gold backing, no physical constraint, nothing preventing unlimited money creation except institutional discipline, and that discipline has proven absent when tested, because during every crisis, during every period of stress, the response has been the same. Print money, expand the money supply, monetize government debt, and transfer the costs to savers through inflation and currency debasement. Look at what happened after 2008, because the financial crisis created an emergency that justified extraordinary measures, and the extraordinary measure chosen was quantitative easing, which is just a sophisticated term for the Federal Reserve creating trillions of dollars from nothing and using that money to buy government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. And this was possible only because of what happened in 1971, because as long as there was gold backing, even theoretical gold backing, there were limits to how much money could be created. But once that backing was removed, once we entered the pure fiat world, the only limits became political and psychological, became about what central banks could justify and what markets would accept. And those limits proved remarkably flexible when institutions needed saving. And here's what makes 1971 the pivotal crime, the foundational crime that enabled everything that came after. Because once you remove the physical anchor, once you make money purely confidence-based, you create an incentive structure that inevitably leads to debasement, because governments always face pressure to spend more than they collect, always face crises that justify printing, always have reasons why this time is different, why the emergency is real, why caution can be suspended, and without a physical constraint that forces reckoning regardless of political pressure, the printing continues, the money supply expands, and savers watch their purchasing power erode year after year, decade after decade, and they're told, this is normal, this is how modern economies work, this is the price of stability and growth. But what it actually is, what it's always been, is a transfer of wealth from people who save in currency to institutions that create and control currency. Once you see the system, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to believing that your dollars are a reliable store of value when the entire history since 1971 demonstrates that they're designed to lose value systematically, when the institutions managing the currency have both the ability and the incentive to debase it, when every crisis produces the same response regardless of who holds political power, and this understanding changes how you evaluate your own financial situation. Because if dollars are guaranteed to lose purchasing power over time, if this loss is policy rather than accident, then strategies that made sense under gold backing don't make sense under pure fiat. Think about what savings meant before 1971, when there was at least theoretical gold backing, when dollars represented claims on something with intrinsic scarcity versus what savings means now, when dollars represent only confidence in institutions, and confidence can be managed, shaped, eroded gradually enough that most people don't notice until decades have passed and their purchasing power has been cut in half, and the crime isn't just what happened in 1971, it's that this crime continues every single year through inflation that's presented as economic management rather than theft, through policies that deliberately keep interest rates below inflation rates so that savers lose purchasing power while debtors benefit, through a system that makes dollars lose value by design and then calls this stability. Now here's where this connects to what comes next, because the pure fiat system created in 1971 has a problem, and the problem is that it requires continuous growth, continuous expansion of debt, continuous money creation to service existing obligations, and there are mathematical limits to how long this can continue before the confidence that holds the system together starts to crack, and we're approaching those limits now, with government debt exceeding 125% of economic output, with interest payments consuming over $1 trillion annually, with money supply having expanded by trillions in just the past few years, and the institutions managing this system understand the problem, understand that pure fiat creates instability that eventually requires even more drastic measures to manage, and those measures are being built right now, and they involve technology that makes the crime of 1971 seem almost quaint by comparison. And this is why following this series matters, why subscribing and watching each episode as it releases is fundamentally different from consuming random videos, because we're building a historical framework layer by layer, showing you first how the gold backing removal enabled unlimited currency creation, then how that currency creation systematically destroyed savings value, then what mechanisms are being developed to take this further, and people who subscribe and follow sequentially, who turn on notifications and watch as each new crime against savings gets documented, they're developing understanding that compounds, that makes each new episode more valuable because it builds on previous context, whereas people who see isolated pieces never develop the framework that shows how everything connects. So here's what needs to happen. Subscribe to this channel now, turn on notifications because the next video in this series reveals the next major crime in this sequence, the specific decision made in the 1980s that accelerated the transfer of wealth from savers to financial institutions, and once you see how that decision built on what happened in 1971, how each crime enables the next, how the system evolves toward greater extraction and control, you'll understand why this isn't just history, why these patterns continue operating today, why your retirement savings exist within a system designed to transfer value away from you, and why people who understand this early make different choices than people who trust blindly. And those different choices matter enormously when you're trying to preserve wealth across decades in a system architected against preservation. But understanding alone isn't enough, because what we're building here is a community investigation into how power operates through monetary systems across time, and that investigation happens not just through watching, but through thinking, discussing, challenging ideas, testing analysis against each other's reasoning and experience. And this is why the comment section isn't just feedback, it's continuation. It's where the video's thesis gets examined rigorously, where historical parallels get explored, where disagreement sharpens analysis rather than shutting it down. So the video doesn't end when the screen goes black. It continues here in the comments, and here's what I want you to think through and discuss. If removing gold backing in 1971 eliminated the physical constraint on money creation and led predictably to decades of systematic savings destruction through inflation, and if this happened not through accident, but through policy choices made by people who understood exactly what they were doing, then what does that tell us about the nature of fiat currency systems? About whether restraint can ever be maintained when it depends purely on institutional discipline rather than physical limits? And more practically, what strategies make sense for preserving wealth when the currency itself is designed to lose value because traditional advice assumes that saving dollars will preserve purchasing power, but everything since 1971 demonstrates the opposite. So where does that leave people who are trying to plan for retirement in a system that guarantees their savings will be worth less? And at what point does participating in dollar savings become irrational despite all social and legal pressure pushing toward that participation? Write out your thinking carefully. Read what others have written. Respond with substance rather than slogans, because this space has become a genuine investigation, a place where people examine difficult questions without pretending they have easy answers. And your perspective matters. Your reasoning contributes. Your willingness to engage seriously with ideas that challenge mainstream assumptions is what makes this community valuable, and this continuation through dialogue is itself part of the series, part of how understanding deepens beyond what any single video can convey. So don't treat this as passive consumption. Treat it as active investigation, and share your analysis in the comments below.